Imagine this. You wake up one morning, and for a brief moment, just before full consciousness arrives, everything feels fine. The room is warm, the light through the curtains is soft. There is no crisis pulling at you, no emergency, no immediate threat. By every measurable standard, your life is working. You have shelter, people who love you, a career that is moving, or at least moving enough. Enough income to eat well, sleep safely, and fill your weekends with things that are supposed to feel like living. And then it happens. Before you've even sat up, it arrives. That low, gray, wordless feeling. Not sadness in the way you describe it to someone, not anxiety with a clear object. Something quieter and far more disturbing. A hollow sense that something essential is missing, though you couldn't name it if your life depended on it. You get up anyway. You make coffee. You move through the architecture of a life that from the outside looks completely assembled. And somewhere between the shower and the first notification on your phone, you bury it. You have to. Because how do you explain to anyone? How do you explain to yourself that you feel deeply, inexplicably unfulfilled when nothing is actually wrong? This feeling has a name. Jung knew it, and by the end of this, so will you. If what you just felt reading that is recognition, not curiosity, but recognition, then this channel exists for you. Subscribe, because we go deep here, every single time. Now, here is the paradox that should genuinely disturb you. We live in the most materially furnished era in all of human history. The average person today commands warmth, food, entertainment, communication, and convenience that would have seemed impossible, magical even, to nobility just 3 centuries ago. We have solved, or are aggressively solving, the great logistical problems of human survival. Pain can be muted, pleasure can be engineered. Distraction is available at any hour, in infinite variety, delivered directly into your palm. And yet, loneliness is at historic highs. Anxiety disorders are the most widespread mental health condition on the planet. Burnout is no longer an exception, it is a cultural baseline. People describe their lives as busy and their inner worlds as hollow in the same breath without hearing the contradiction echoing back at them. Why? Why is it that the more elaborately we construct the outside of our lives, the more unbearable the inside becomes? Why do we labor so ferociously to build something we can barely stand to sit inside? Why does finally getting the thing, the promotion, the relationship, the apartment, the recognition, deliver a satisfaction that dissolves within weeks, sometimes days, before the hunger returns, stronger, louder, and more bewildering than before? Carl Jung saw this, not as a passing cultural observation, not vaguely. He saw it with the precision of a man who had spent decades sitting across from people who had, by every external measure, succeeded, and had come to him quietly desperate because none of it felt the way they had been promised it would. In his foreword to the spiritual teaching of Ramana Maharshi, Jung described the pattern with almost clinical clarity. We spend enormous amounts of time and energy, he observed, building what he called the house of life, the career, the income, the reputation, the carefully maintained lifestyle. We become master architects of the external, perfectionists of the visible. We do everything for the house. We sacrifice sleep, relationships, presence, and decades of our interior life to make the house more impressive, more stable, more worthy of admiration. But the person living inside the house, ignored, starved, slowly suffocating behind walls that look, from the street, absolutely immaculate. Jung wrote that while it is undoubtedly more comfortable to dwell in a well-ordered and furnished house, that comfort answers nothing about who the dweller actually is, or whether that dweller's soul shares anything resembling the same order and cleanliness as the walls surrounding it. And this, he warned, is where the real catastrophe hides. Because the starving parts of our psyche do not go quietly. They surface, disguised, as unexplained anxiety that arrives without cause, as a boredom that refuses to lift no matter how packed your schedule becomes, as chronic, compulsive comparison to others that leaves you diminished even when you are winning, as an existential emptiness so formless and so persistent that you begin to suspect the problem is not your circumstances. The problem, you start to fear, is you. It isn't. But the truth of what it actually is, that is far more confronting. The problem did not begin with you. It began long before you were born, woven into the fabric of the culture you inherited, the education system that shaped you, the economic machinery you were quietly inducted into before you were old enough to question any of it. To understand why so many people live with this nameless inner poverty despite outward abundance, you have to go beneath the surface of individual psychology and look at something structural, something almost architectural in its design. Jung had a name for the force responsible. He called it the persona. In ancient Rome, the persona was the mask worn by theater actors, a physical object held up to signal to the audience who the character was. Jung borrowed this image deliberately because he observed that human beings, from the earliest age, are trained to construct and maintain a mask of their own, a curated, socially acceptable version of themselves designed not for inner truth, but for outer approval. We learn, through reward and punishment, through praise and rejection, which parts of ourselves are welcome in the world and which must be hidden. The compliant child is applauded, the ambitious student is celebrated, the productive employee is promoted, the successful adult is admired. At every stage, the message is consistent and unambiguous. The external performance is what matters. Build the mask, maintain the mask. Identify so completely with the mask that you eventually forget it as one. And this is precisely where the suffering begins. Because beneath the persona, beneath the performance of success, competence, and composure, lives everything that was never given permission to exist. Jung called this the shadow. Not evil, not weakness in the way we conventionally understand it, but the accumulated weight of every suppressed desire, every unexpressed grief, every authentic impulse that was deemed too inconvenient, too vulnerable, or too threatening to the carefully constructed image above it. Friedrich Nietzsche, decades before Jung formalized this in psychological language, had already sensed the same wound. He watched modern man construct elaborate systems of meaning, social, religious, professional, and then hollow them out from the inside through unconscious self-deception. Nietzsche called this resentment, the slow, corrosive resentment that builds in people who have abandoned their own authentic drives in favor of what the herd demands, and then quietly blame the world for the emptiness that follows. Arthur Schopenhauer went further still. He argued that human desire is structurally incapable of delivering lasting satisfaction, not because we are choosing the wrong things, but because the will itself is insatiable. The moment one desire is met, another rises to replace it. We are not chasing happiness, Schopenhauer warned. We are on a treadmill, mistaking motion for progress. And then is Jean-Paul Sartre, who identified something perhaps most unsettling of all: the terror of authentic freedom. Sartre observed that human beings are condemned to be free, yet spend the vast majority of their lives running from that freedom into what he called bad faith, the comfortable lie of pretending that external roles, social scripts, and inherited expectations are not choices, but simply the way things are. It is easier to become the role than to ask who you are beneath it. What all of these minds were circling, Jung, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and Sartre, was the same invisible catastrophe approached from different directions. The catastrophe of a life lived entirely on the surface. When the inner life is neglected long enough, it does not simply wait patiently for attention. It begins to communicate in the only language left available to it: disruption. Anxiety without a clear source, a restlessness that no holiday can cure, a creeping sense that the self you present to the world and the self that lies beneath it are becoming strangers to each other. And the wider that gap grows, the louder the symptoms become. What Jung understood, and what took the entire Western world by surprise, was that this was not a personal failing. It was a collective one. and its consequences run far deeper than most people dare to look. Here is what nobody tells you about a life lived on the surface. It does not announce its damage loudly. It does not arrive with a clear diagnosis, a dramatic breakdown, or a single identifiable moment you can point to and say, "There, that is where it went wrong." Instead, it operates the way the most dangerous things always do, slowly, silently, and in a direction you are not looking. The first consequence is the one Jung identified most precisely, the symptom that masquerades as personality. You know this person. You may be this person. The high-functioning individual who is always busy, always producing, always optimizing, and who, in the rare moments of stillness, feels a panic so subtle and so swift that they immediately reach for their phone, their schedule, their next task, before it can fully surface. Stillness becomes the enemy. Silence becomes threatening, because in silence, the gap between the persona and the soul becomes audible, and that sound is unbearable to someone who has spent years learning not to hear it. Neuroscience has begun to map what Jung observed clinically. The default mode network, the brain system that activates during rest, introspection, and self-referential thinking, is the same network associated with rumination, anxiety, and what researchers describe as mind wandering toward threat. In other words, the brain, when given space to turn inward, does not naturally drift toward peace. In people who have long suppressed their inner life, it drifts toward unprocessed material, toward everything that was buried rather than integrated. The stillness does not feel like rest, it feels like confrontation. And so we run. We run into productivity culture, which has constructed an entire moral framework around busyness. To be busy is to be worthy. To be constantly achieving is to be constantly justified. Aldous Huxley saw this coming with terrifying clarity in Brave New World, a civilization that had not been enslaved through force or fear, but through the far more elegant mechanism of distraction. Give people enough comfort, enough stimulation, enough engineered pleasure, and they will voluntarily surrender the one thing that might have saved them, the willingness to sit with themselves. The second consequence is what psychologists now call hedonic adaptation, and it is perhaps the cruelest trick the human mind plays on itself. Every external achievement, every acquisition, every milestone reached registers in the nervous system as significant. Briefly, the raise, the relationship, the recognition, the new apartment. For a window of days or weeks, something in you relaxes, the hunger quiets. You think, this is it. This is the one that will finally hold. And then the baseline shifts. The new level becomes the new normal, and the hunger returns. Not smaller, but larger, because now it knows that satisfaction is possible, and impatient that it has already dissolved. This is the treadmill Schopenhauer described, not a metaphor, a measurable neurological reality. The brain habituates to reward. It is wired not for contentment, but for more. The third consequence is the most socially invisible, and perhaps the most devastating. When the inner life is starved long enough, identity itself begins to hollow out. People lose the ability to answer with any genuine certainty the question, what do I actually want? Not what they are supposed to want, not what their industry, their family, their social circle has conditioned them to pursue, but what they, the actual living person beneath the persona, genuinely desire from their one finite existence. Viktor Frankl, writing from the wreckage of Auschwitz, identified this as the existential vacuum, a condition he predicted would become the defining neurosis of the 20th century and beyond. Not suffering born of deprivation, but suffering born of emptiness, of a life that functions perfectly on the outside, while meaning quietly drains from it like water through cupped hands. And Frankl's most haunting observation was this: the existential vacuum does not always announce itself as despair. More often, it disguises itself as boredom, as that vague, persistent dissatisfaction that follows you from Sunday afternoon into Monday morning. That sense that even your pleasures feel slightly flat, that the things that used to light something in you have grown dim without explanation. This is not ingratitude. This is not weakness. This is a psyche that has been asking, quietly, persistently, through every symptom and every hollow moment, a question that has never been answered. And the question, when you finally let yourself hear it, is both simpler and more radical than anything you have been chasing. What if everything you were taught about building a good life was not wrong, but incomplete in a way that made it dangerous? Not maliciously, not through conspiracy or deliberate deception, but through a collective blind spot so widespread, so culturally normalized that questioning it feels almost transgressive, like standing up in the middle of a ceremony everyone else is participating in and asking, "But what are we actually doing here?" That is exactly what Jung did, and it cost him. His break with Sigmund Freud, the most seismic rupture in the history of psychoanalysis, was not merely academic, it was personal, philosophical, almost spiritual in its implications. Freud believed that the unconscious was primarily a reservoir of repressed drives, dark, chaotic, something to be managed and controlled. Jung looked into the same darkness and saw something radically different. He saw intelligence. He saw a living, communicating interior world that was not the enemy of the conscious self, but its most essential and neglected partner. The rebellion Jung proposed was not dramatic in the way revolutions usually are. There were no manifestos nailed to doors, no marches, no public declarations. It was quieter than that, and for that reason, far more difficult. He called it individuation. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not optimization. It is not the process of becoming a better, more productive, more admirable version of your current persona. It is something almost opposite. The deliberate, courageous process of turning toward everything inside you that the world told you to ignore. The suppressed, the inconvenient, the unresolved. The shadow, given not permission to destroy, but permission to speak. This is the counterintuitive shift that changes everything. The solution to the hollow life is not addition. It is not more achievement, more experience, more acquisition layered on top of the existing structure. It is subtraction of the false, the gradual, sometimes painful dismantling of the persona you constructed for survival, to discover what was living beneath it all along. History is scattered with people who made this turn. Tolstoy, at the height of his fame, celebrated across Europe, wealthy, admired, surrounded by a life any rational person would envy, suffered a collapse so complete he described being unable to walk near a rope without contemplating hanging himself from it. Not because his life was bad, because it was entirely external, entirely surface, entirely performed. It was only when he turned radically inward, abandoning the identity of the celebrated genius, stripping back the persona to its foundation, that something in him stabilized. What he found was not comfort. It was ground, solid, unperformable, unacquirable ground. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote in his Letters to a Young Poet that the only journey worth taking is the one inward, and that most people spend their lives arranging the furniture of their external existence precisely to avoid making it. The practical implication of this is more radical than it sounds. It means that the anxiety you have been medicating with productivity is not a malfunction, it is a message. It means that the boredom you have been drowning in stimulation is not laziness, it is your psyche refusing to be silenced. It means that the inexplicable grief that surfaces on Sunday evenings, or in the quiet after a celebration, or in the middle of a perfectly adequate life, is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that something in you is still alive, still reaching, still refusing to accept the surface as the whole story. The rebellion Jung proposed begins not with grand gestures, but with a single radical act of honesty. Sitting still long enough to hear what has been trying to reach you. Not fixing it immediately, not reframing it into something manageable, not converting it into a content or a 5-step morning routine, simply hearing it, allowing the question to exist without rushing toward an answer. Because the question itself, when you finally stop running from it, is not the threat. It is the beginning of the only life that was ever truly yours. And what waits at the end of that inward journey, what Jung spent his entire career pointing toward, is something so fundamental, so quietly revolutionary, that most people will live their entire lives on its doorstep without ever stepping through. There is a moment that Jung described, not in clinical language, not in the detached vocabulary of academic psychology, but with the quiet urgency of a man who had seen it happen enough times to know it was real. It is the moment a person stops. Not stops achieving, not stops performing, not stops maintaining the elaborate architecture of a life built for external approval, but stops internally, completely. The moment the relentless forward momentum of a surface existence finally meets something immovable, something that will not be optimized, rebranded, or outrun. Something that simply is. Jung called this the confrontation with the self. Capital S, distinct from the ego, distinct from the persona, distinct from every identity you have ever constructed or been assigned. The self, in Jungian terms, is not the you that was shaped by your parents' expectations, your culture's definitions of success, your industry's metrics of worth. It is something older than all of that, something that existed before the world got to you, and that has been waiting with extraordinary patience for you to find your way back. And here is the truth that most people spend their entire lives unconsciously fleeing. You already know something is wrong. Not intellectually, not as a theory you encountered in a book or a video. You know it the way you know things that live beneath language, in the body, in the quality of your mornings, in the specific texture of the silence that falls after a long day of performing yourself for other people. You have always known. The symptoms were never random. The anxiety, the hollow satisfaction, the persistent sense of living adjacent to your own existence rather than inside it. None of it was malfunction. It was correspondence. Your inner life, starved and ignored and spoken over for years, was writing to you in the only language available to it. And the tragedy, the real tragedy that Jung devoted his life to addressing, is not that people suffer. It is that they suffer without understanding what the suffering is for. They treat the message as the problem. They medicate the letter rather than reading it. Here is what the letter actually says. The life you have been building, the career, the reputation, the carefully maintained image, the accumulating evidence of a life well constructed, is not the enemy. Jung never argued for burning it down, for abandoning responsibility, for retreating into navel-gazing self-absorption. What he argued for was something far more precise and far more demanding: integration. The willingness to hold both, the outer and the inner, the persona and the shadow, the life you have built and the self that has been living quietly uncredited beneath it, simultaneously, without splitting them, without sacrificing one for the other, without pretending that the discomfort of the gap between them is something that the next achievement will finally close. Because it won't. It never has. And some part of you, the part that recognizes itself in everything you have read here, already knows that too. Viktor Frankl, who understood human suffering at a depth most of us will never be asked to approach, made an observation that has never left me since I first encountered it. He said that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lives human freedom, human growth, the entire possibility of a life consciously chosen rather than unconsciously performed. That space, that gap between what happens to you and how you respond to it, is where the self lives. It is where Jung spent his career pointing. It is what every philosopher, every poet, every mystic who ever turned genuinely inward were circling toward in their own language from their own direction. And here is the final, most unsettling truth of all. That space has always been available to you. It was available on the mornings you woke up hollow and immediately reached for your phone. It was available in the evenings you numbed the quiet with noise. It was available in every moment of inexplicable grief, every flash of boredom at the height of your success, every Sunday afternoon that carried, beneath its ordinary surface, the faint but unmistakable weight of a life not yet fully inhabited. The space was always there. The question was never whether it existed. The question was whether you were willing to enter it. And this is what Jung was actually warning us about. Not that the external life is worthless, not that ambition is poison or achievement is illusion, but that a life constructed entirely on the outside, without a corresponding journey inward, is a life lived in exile from yourself. A beautifully furnished house with no one home, walls that look immaculate from the street, and rooms that echo. The people who break this pattern, who make the turn Jung described, who begin the slow, unglamorous, profoundly necessary work of individuation, do not suddenly become free of difficulty. They do not arrive at some permanent state of enlightened contentment where nothing hurts and everything feels meaningful. That is not what wholeness looks like. What changes is something quieter than that. They stop being strangers to themselves. They begin to recognize the difference between a life that is impressive and a life that is inhabited, between performing existence and actually living it, between the house and the dweller. And once you have seen that distinction, truly seen it, felt it in the specific gravity of your own hollow moments, you can't unsee it. You are standing at that threshold right now. The question Jung left us with, the one that echoes through every symptom, every unexplained ache, every moment of fullness that somehow still feels like lack, is not what more do I need to build? It is who is doing the living. Sit with that, not as a thought experiment, not as content to be consumed and scrolled past, but as the most urgent and most intimate question your one finite life is asking you. The house can wait. The dweller has waited long enough.